Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Munro podcast. I'm Kevin Hardy, one of the engineers here at Munro Associates. So I've been here for about 10 years or so, and I kind of focus mostly on body structures and chassis components, things of that nature, and essentially cost reduction around those parts and designing for manufacturing for them. So today's guest is Adam Munro, founder of Zero Labs. So Zero Labs is a mobility company. You kind of focus on design, the engineering, manufacturing, and working with other brands kind of in that design and mobility space for electric vehicles. You found this roughly 2015, and one of the things that Eric was kind of super keyed in on is, you used to be a professional skateboarder, and you've owned a technology company before this, and you've really kind of, with Zero Labs, trying to bring the past kind of into the future itself. So, thank you. And if there's anything else you'd like to add, please feel free. So
no, that's a good lead in. I think that it's an exciting category, and it's a hard category, definitely the hardest thing I've ever done.
Okay.
And that includes like climbing mountains and, or having kids to a certain extent. But it offers it a potential of a reward of seeing the world change. And I think that that's kind of what drives us all, is like, it doesn't have to be, we don't have to face an army of just plastic new cars. We can actually see the things we care about carry forwards. And I think that, if anything, that's sort of the impetus of the driver that gets all in this category going, is like, it's close,
Yeah. So. I mean, I think you hit on an interesting point there. I have a lot of friends that, they're hot rodders or whatever you want to call it, right? LS swaps, all sorts of things, just different powertrains, different types of things, whatever works, they kind of like, they trend to. But, and a lot of them are kind of interested in EVs. A good friend of mine was very interested in our Model Y EDMs that we had from the Austin built vehicle with the Giga castings, because really we didn't want the rest of it. A lot of it was similar. All we wanted was what was unique essentially from the previous Model Y. Ultimately, the battery price is kind of, and even just integrating the battery and BMS into a vehicle, he wanted to do a 57 Chevy, kind of what scared him away. But, he's interested. And I think in a large part because I don't think he really dislikes Teslas per se or anything like that, but he thinks they're boring, right? He'd much rather have a square body Chevy, like the lines are kind of iconic. And even I'm a little bit more of a Ford homer myself, but I've had an old, K5 Blazer, and they're just classic lines. I think a lot of people appreciate that. So, well, I think we've kind of gone into what, one of the things I think is interesting is kind of this overall, this transformation, but I don't want to lose it before we get into any more details, but you say you have some partners and you want to work with others in this space. I'm just kind of curious, how often that happens and how successful that's been for you, because it is kind of like a budding industry, and a lot of people are relying heavily on each other, whether you're an OEM, tier 1, tier 2, it's a very interesting time right now. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think, with any industry, let's forget it's just electrification industry. With any industry, when it begins, I think at first there's this idea that people have, they're just going to show up and dominate the category, become the category killer. And that has never been the case. It'll never be the case. There's an interdependency within a new business model that they actually need each other to survive. Meaning I'll pick an example, skateboarding back in the old days, we all needed each other. We may not like each other all, we may have very different levels, but if the industry itself doesn't stick together and bond, it has no chance. And I think when I was in 19 years old or in college, I started a digital type foundry, and there really was no such thing back then. That was all people were shooting pictures of existing typefaces and scanning them and making them bigger on a camera.
Right.
Digital typefaces didn't exist. So when we all started making digital typefaces, we were all absolutely best friends with anybody else who did that. We didn't even think about competition. We were clinging to the life raft. We need to bond together. This is kind of how multicellular organisms came to exist. It's how humans came to exist, as we all cooperated to make ourselves stronger. And I think this industry is no different. I think that the idea that one can annihilate the others is never going to be the case. And if anything, my last company was also a new category. And what you see is the you need you need to see everybody grow because it legitimizes the overall category. I would constantly go and promote my competition and say, these guys are great at this and these guys are great at this, because you need the category to be successful for you to be successful. And I think that's often misunderstood in business, as people think, well, I'm going to come along and sweep the category and own it, but they can't. That's why Tesla gave away their patents.
Sure.
They need the category to grow. They can't just go in there and go, we're going to own everything, any more than you see how much better open source is done than proprietary. It's got to be that way. And so I think our industry we are friends. Not all of us, though. There is a dichotomy that has grown, and it's predictable, but it is, for the most part, those within those dichometric separations are really close to each other. But overall, we share a common goal. How we get there is probably what's different.
Sure. That's fair. And one of the things like on your website that I found like very, very interesting essentially was, that this thought that you're going to leverage technology and modularity essentially to overcome, mass manufacturing. And it's kind of it's a broad and yet specific statement. I'm just kind of curious, like what that means to you and Zero Labs, because it's something that I struggle with working with OEMs. Volume is everything. We make any changes, it could be troublesome at times for.
Well, I think with what's happened with low volume manufacturing, I think in the old days you had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to stamp out a body panel, and it would take, another hundreds of thousands of dollars to create that panel to even work. The barrier to entry of producing a vehicle was impossibly high. But I think what's happening now with composites and low volume vehicle manufacturing and 3D printing and additive metals and plastics and so on, is that you're seeing the ability to produce very good quality parts, in some cases better than what existed in the original OEMs. You're seeing them available now. So you don't have to invest in huge stamping machines, and this trend is increasing significantly. So that means that you are capable of producing a low volume number of parts without the huge burden of industrialization costs that used to exist even 10 years ago. So what that's doing is it's lowering the volume requirements to produce those parts. It doesn't mean you can do it affordably yet.
Sure.
But that's coming.
I guess I kind of get right into it. When doing a little bit of research, obviously your carbon intensive Bronco, was on Top Gear. So, and which it looks great, by the way. And frankly, it's very reminiscent of Singer to me, as far as kind of that business model and kind of what they have done with the Porsche, actually kind of very select, bodies of Porsches. I think they're 964s but don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not a big Porsche guy. I like them, but probably will never, unfortunately, own one. But I think it was interesting to me, right? You guys were talking about the composites and the carbon, and just in general, I'm kind of curious. Right now, the way I understand it, essentially, whether you're sourcing vehicles or a customer is providing vehicles, you're essentially stripping them down, redoing them. And for this particular vehicle, you were very carbon intensive. I think that's like a particular addition that you're building.
Yeah.
The composites sometimes offer huge advantages, right? Like original 60 sheet metal sometimes those, especially on the early Broncos, their engine boxes, very boxy, almost like brake bent pieces, things of that nature. And, the outside, they look good. They have great lines. But what I'd like to know is like, how difficult is it for you to use, like in your steel bodied cars, either original metal or reproduction? And then what kind of opportunities has going into composites afforded you and your business?
Well, it's a good question. And I think the answer is counterintuitive. You would assume that getting into composites would be harder and that using original steel parts would be easier. But the reality is that the way they made those cars back then, and this is not just like a Bronco thing, this is like all OEMs back then, they used stamped metal parts, but the tolerances were not anything close to what you would tolerate today. So you can have 11 millimeter tolerances, stick your finger in the top of the car and go all the way through. And on the bottom, you can't even stick your credit card in it. And that was considered okay back then. But now that's considered horrible. And so you have to overcome 60 years of change, in one move. Making metal do that is really tough, especially because whether it's the old part, which, original parts actually do fit better together than aftermarket parts. Because aftermarket parts, let's remember, was never meant to be a hobby kit for building a whole car.
Sure.
It's become that, but it was never meant to be that. And so what happens with that is that those were designed for like crash replacement parts. Like someone hits you, you go, oh, okay, let's come up with a new fender. Someone smashes you, here's a new grill. Not to build a whole car with it. So not surprisingly, those are all made in different factories at different times with different metals, with different stamps. All the registration's wrong. All the connections are wrong. And so it's a lot harder to make the aftermarket and metal parts work together than it is carbon. Carbon is designed to be perfect. Like it's literally like, we'll just slot together and like, there, you're done. Carbon, whereas like steel, it's like trying to make a square out of circles. It's like, you just are not going to ever get it right. You fix this one thing and then this one wants to pop loose, and you're heating it and shaping it and trying to get it to work. And so, there are guys out there who are content with that. They're like, that to them, that's good enough. But that lends to some credibility problems. You build a whole car out of crash part replacement parts, it's going to be really tough to have the lines that you think you're getting.
Sure.
Carbon has advantages of that. But it's initially it's expensive, but then it gets down to cost of materials versus cost of labor.
Right.
Your material costs are higher, but your labor costs are fractional. We can actually do a carbon fiber faster than we can a steel car.
So are you guys doing like vacuum, like vacuum bagging or autoclave carbon?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways to do that. Wet layup is one and vac forming is the other. We did ours in vac forming because there is some structural components to it. If you're not doing structural, we're borrowing all these lessons really from aerospace.
Right.
But non-structural components, what we call like the wet layup parts, that you can get away with that in our engine bays. We don't use structural because they're just more cosmetic. But if it's a panel that has structural rigidity, you kind of want to use pre-preg.
Yeah.
And if you can, it actually isn't entirely necessary, but you should as best practices. That's what Singer does. That's what a lot of people in aerospace do. But you can do it. You can do it without that. I think the necessity of it is a little bit overrated.
Okay. So I'm just kind of curious, if we're getting out of like the realm of death, I apologize, but you mentioned a lot with the rapid prototyping. So I'm assuming you're probably, scanning surfaces, prepping them, and are you leveraging, additive manufacturing to do like any backing support, and bonding them to these panels to make better interfaces that you can control?
Well, you can build the tooling into the product. So like, for example, a lot of the original parts didn't have the right flanges or structural support. So you can build that into it. You can add additional flanges, additional support. So we've, for example, like on our Bronco, a rear fender has an upper and lower and a 3/4 and a rocker panel. So it's 4 completely different parts that are supposed to just fit together neatly, and they don't ever, So we consolidated it. We have one rear panel that's 4 parts all at once. And it's just like slots right in there. It's the rear quarter, it's the upper and lower, and the rocker panel all in one piece.
Okay. And do you find yourselves essentially with some of these panels that you're making, adding a lot of locating features and things to help you guys assemble it?
Yeah, we build the tool into the body, into the tub, and then we register it to that. So it just becomes a lot easier.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I think there's 9 different vehicles that you plan on offering. Are you going to offer essentially that level of resculpting on all of them, or focus or is there only going to be maybe special carbon editions or certain parts on some of those vehicles going forward?
I think that's a good question. And I think like there's what we want to do and what that we are necessitated to do. When we first started, to go back to your original point, we thought we were going to be like a Singer of electric vehicles, right? That we're going to have this impeccable, detailed craftsmanship, that we're going to build these perfect specimens of like what we call internally like high resolution versions of the classics that don't look good from like, tiny little thumbnail pictures, but you can actually like put your face up against it that close and going, this shit does not, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And that is the cars we built. But here's the problem. Most of the market doesn't know the difference between your car and the one that is made of stamped crash parts. Because in the end, here's a $300,000 car, a $250,000 car. they don't know or even care that it is the one or the other. So that's the first kind of major difference, is that the consumer doesn't seem to care too much which versions of that is, because their priority is less on the impeccable craftsmanship and the quality. It's more about how quickly can I get it. And
Okay. No,
so,
that's fair.
so it's more like, I'm willing to get by with stuff that maybe isn't as perfect if I can get that car in 6 months. But do I want to wait 2 years to have this perfect carbon fiber? I mean, Singer is known to have like 5 and 6 year wait periods sometimes, and that you get a lot of dropout with that.
Sure.
And then when people do get it, there's this expectation. There's an intolerance to anything that's not right about it. So that's kind of like, I would say, from a behavioral level, not anything we anticipated, but it makes perfect sense. And the other thing is like getting investor support or backing to do that. Singer finally got backing after years of being solo. And we said, okay, we're going to do like, 100 of these cars. And we had all the sales to go with it and all the tooling and everything set up to go. And investors are like, cool, I'm just going to buy a car, but I'm not going to help support it. So we got a lot of these like venture capital guys placing orders, but nobody wanted to back the industry. So then the idea we thought would be that we would get supported to grow that sort of high-end business, kind of like a Rimac or a Koenigsegg did, getting their backing, and it just never shows up. And, what you find is like that is a business that could easily exist, but you have to be backed for it. There's no cost-effective way of producing. There's no cheap way to do expensive things.
Right.
Not without backing. Like Apple didn't make one iPhone and go, what we're going to do? We're going to make a whole business out of this one phone. We're going to sell 2 of them and 8 of them. And eventually over years, we'll recoup those cost efficiencies and build an Apple campus. They had the campus and the billions of dollars to make that possible.
Sure.
And I think that that's sort of what's misunderstood in our industry, is you can't reinvest the profits to work your way to cheaper. The cheaper comes from investment. Tesla didn't reinvent its profits from the S's and the X to build a big enough company to make the Model 3 possible. They took on shit tons of money to do that.
Right.
And that's not understood in our industry, but it's true in every industry,
Yeah. I mean, it's very, like you mentioned with the stampings, and like a snapshot of my day, we decided I'll outline like, hey, if we were to change X, Y, and Z, there's this type of opportunity. They're like, no problem. Okay, so we're going to need a new tool for this, and we're going to need the ED&T for this, and all this stuff. And you're like, okay, so this is going to be like $4 million to do this? We're like, yeah. And sometimes it'll tar out, right? And you're like, okay, this is still positive for us. We're willing to do it. But you have to have essentially hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in the bank when you look at this and you're like, well, what's come across my desk today? Oh, this makes sense. Approve. And then that process starts, so it's kind of interesting.
I mean, you learn a lot that investor support is not this sort of logical algorithm of like prove the market, long-term trajectory, barriers to entry, moats, willing customer base, all this stuff you think's true. It's not true. It's very much like herd mentality. Like if someone else goes forward, then they'll go, we're all in on this. It doesn't matter. Like Richard Branson could endorse like, I don't know, like radioactive cookware, like depleted uranium cookware, but it'll kill you. But Branson's behind it, so we got to get into that. And on
Sure.
And that company would have no problem getting funding, even though it most definitely will kill you. But something more logical that isn't backed like that is never going to get started, because then you realize you need that sort of prime mover. The first law of Newtonian physics, you need that first mover to make the ball roll. And that seems to be what a lot of venture capital is driven on. So as a business, we have all had to adapt to that and say, okay, we've got massive in the EV conversion space. We've all got this massive book of sales request lists going for years on end. Zero Labs has 70, I think we stopped counting at 77,500 order requests that are qualified. Like, we're never going to be able to make that without support. And investors are like, yeah, great. Let us know when your lead investor shows up. I'm like, why can't that be you? We're not asking for OEM money. We're asking for conversion money. And that's a pennies on the dollar, easier to do. So now we're kind of like, we in the industry overall are like, what can we do with what we have? Because, investors aren't showing up anytime soon. And yet they're ready to go the minute that lead guy shows up and goes, I'm going to make this happen. We need our Richard Branson moment where somebody steps forward and going, I'm going to own this category. I'm going to make this happen.
Right.
And until that happens, everyone's kind of waiting around. It's like a big row of penguins all lined up on the cliff with thousands of fish thrashing below, but they're all looking at each other going like, are you going to go first? I'm not going to go first. Are you going to go first? They all want to make sure that we don't get eaten by a sea lion. But meanwhile, they're missing this beautiful feast right below them. And once the first one goes, the rest will jump in after. So this will become a multi-billion-dollar industry after that moment. But because the market is there, the money is there, the category is there, the technology is there, the customers are trying to buy this.
Right.
And none of us can produce anything close to the demands we get against scale because we don't have the funding to address the scalable market.
Okay. So, and do you think do you think some of that has to do with maybe the vehicle offerings? Like, I'm trying to think like, a Mustang in 1967 was like $2,500, right?
Right.
And obviously that's not the case now. And, automobiles from a price perspective have trended pretty well with inflation and all that stuff. They're expensive now, but, I don't want to say so is everything, but they are unbelievably consistent. I think they're tracking extremely consistently and frankly, more so than most things. I think just because of how efficient big auto is at essentially getting costs under control and continually driving it down.
Yeah.
But, same thing with the Broncos and like the Land Rovers, the Land Cruisers, like a lot of those were, I guess for like, your regular vehicle in the 60s. Do you think that maybe has something to do with it? Because it's not necessarily, if we use Singer as an example, like a 911, that was always kind of a premium. A Porsche's always been a premium brand, Do you think that has something to do with essentially we're taking, it's relatively expensive to do essentially an EV conversion into, some of these older vehicles, and they themselves, in their original condition are often kind of expensive themselves as well,
Right. No, that's a good question. So I think what would be helpful is to sort of separate the parts, right? So first of all, there's collector cars, which is what you're kind of addressing. Collector cars are really like asset class cars that like sit in some guy's garage. It's beautiful. It works. That thing is appreciated. The stuff you kind of see at like an auction or a Barrett Jackson or something like Ramigam. Those are really not the aftermarket fix-ups, but the original condition. Like that is a specimen that's perfect representation of that era.
Right.
Which means, a restoration means like you don't have Bluetooth or heated seats or, 3-point seat belts. You're rolling around on radials and white walls and lap belts. It's a representation of how it would have been if that had existed. Anything beyond that that's not original is a resto mod.
Right.
I don't think it really matters whether it has a gas motor or a brand new Mustang V8. They didn't come with that motor. You're in resto mod territory, and that point used to be much more debated than it is now. I think we all understand that. So the ones that are collector vehicles, that's kind of its own category, and I think that none of us in the post market address those cars and say like, no one's going to be convinced you're going to make an electric Land Rover and go, oh, but it's a collector car. It's not a collector car anymore. It's a different car. It's a usable car. Most cars in that, in the hundreds of millions, I think there's estimated to be about 100 million classic vehicles in use right now. Most of them are not asset class vehicles. Some are, but it's a smaller number. It's like, I think it's estimated between like 5% of that number is truly collector classic. The rest of them are just used. They're like resto mod, somewhere in between. And so within that, what do you do with that? Do you modernize it, make it usable for a daily driver, or do you try to bring it back to factory? And I think when you get into that category, electrification becomes inevitable because it is both increased usability, it's significantly better performance, and it reduces all the sort of stereotypes of why don't you want a classic car? The answer to that.
Right.
Breaks down, it's loud, it's shitty, it's expensive. I love the tactility of it. That's kind of everyone's argument. But yeah, the unreliability is the reason that you're only driving that car by yourself and your family's not with you in that car.
Sure.
You know, or your wife refuses to get in it because she's going to end up smelling like she mowed the lawn, you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
And so that's where we get into it. It's like, what is the best approach to keep these cars on the road from a usable perspective, right? Not from a collector perspective, but from a usability perspective. And so then you get into the world of like where nostalgia and technology and psychology all kind of intersect, right? And that's sort of the space of EV resto mods. Is you have this function of nostalgia, which is, you know, really that we value the things that are part of our era as kind of an idea of self-identification. It's sort of like, in a weird way, we defend it because it is representative of us. You know, if someone said, we're just going to get rid of all music, you're born in, like, let's say that like MP3s came along and like, I think it was like 2003 or something, like the 2002, and said, all MP3s before this, all music before this is going to go away. We're only going to digitize new music.
Sure.
And at first people are like, yeah, that's great. Lossless, beautiful. And then we're not going to support anything past the MP3s. All that cassette record shit, we're going to throw it away and not support it. We're going to push everybody into buying new music, and old music is gone. Well, that actually did happen. Like, Apple did that, and it was not good for Apple. Like, people were pissed. Because, like, what do you mean I can't listen to my old music on MP3? What do you mean you don't support it? What do you mean it can't be digital? Like, no, let's focus on the new music.
Yeah, Led Zeppelin's still as good as it was in the 60s, you know, in 70s.
Exactly.
So, unlike the cars.
That very thing is exactly what's happening in automotive right now. You know, you have this change in technology that is superior in every way to what preceded it. It's better quality. It's much better experience. It's better performing. More or less, it's lossless. You know, your first drive is as good a quality as your 25th drive or your 100th drive. And that said, there's a line being drawn of what do you do with our past? And the answer is focus on new cars. Let it go. Maybe we'll rebrand. We'll bring back revival brand. We'll bring back the Defender again. We'll bring back the Bronco again. We'll bring back a new version of the Mustang. But that's not really the same. It's
Right.
not your Mustang, you know? And so the opportunity is to digitize the past, to say, let's bring those MP3s, let's bring those old songs and digitize them. Let's remaster the original Tron or the original Star Wars or something. And so you can watch it in the future.
Right.
And, you know, not everything's going to survive. But the important ones will. And that's the market opportunity. And so then you get into the psychology of, well, why do that? What is the point of that? Right. It's because that's you. That's your era. You know, that is your music. That is your brand. That is your cars. Psychology very often misunderstands the function of nostalgia. When you really look at what nostalgia is, it's not this like longing for the old days like people think it is. What nostalgia is it has a neuroprotective function. When we get overwhelmed or depressed or unsure of ourselves, we cling to things that we stuck to in the past, right? I was a skateboarder in the past. I endlessly watch skateboard videos. You know, if I'm talking to my friends on like, you know, Instagram, there's a 99% chance we're sending each other skateboard videos.
Sure.
You know, even though I haven't skated in probably 15 years, it's still part of my past, you know, and I still talk to agency people every day, and that's part of my past too. So we keep those things around because it's who we are. So there's an urgency now in the market. Like, what are we going to do with these old cars? That's my car. It's my era. I don't want to go buy a Tesla. That's a meaningless piece of shit to me. It's like, it drives great, but it has no meaning. It has no soul. I want what I want, but what I want doesn't really work in the future.
Gotcha.
And so that's the big aha moment. You get to keep what's important to you in the past, but you get to express it in a way that is compatible with the future. You know, that's the potential of the category, which is why it's going to be a multi-billion-dollar category. When people put those two together at scale, holy shit, you know?
No, yeah. So one of the things I thought was interesting, you kind of mentioned constrained elegance with the Top Gear episode. And I kind of keyed in on that, right? And it's like, you know, you have what this vehicle is. And so since you guys are driving around Bronco, we'll say with that. And then, you know, is there kind of a formula that you have? Because I think it also speaks to like how much can you change? How much will you change? And how long does that take? Of that constrained elegance. Like we're willing to change, or we target change in these areas. We try to keep everything else as pure as possible. And then from there, do you then kind of, from modularity standpoint, like, we've built a common set of knobs and everything will have this, like a gunmetal finish or whatever it is. We've because they're all kind of from a similar era. And, some of that, while maybe not necessarily, there's differences between Land Rover design language and Ford design language and Chevrolet, but a lot of it is still very similar from the overall area.
Yeah.
How do you, when you target improvements, what kind of is a high level process for that?
That's a really great question. And I don't know that I've actually been asked that question before. So kudos for asking.
Well, thanks.
What it comes down to is this. So going back to nostalgia, my original training when I went to school was in psychology, cognitive behavioral psychology. But I kind of turned that into a career in advertising for a while because I felt like that's a better way of addressing people's needs besides listen to them talk about their problems that they don't want to solve. What you find in nostalgia is that it actually is not a remembrance of the past. It's a distortion, right? You the things you think you remember about your past, very little of that's true. Meaning like you've sanitized your past, you've cleaned it up, you've repurposed it to become a glorified version of it, but you don't remember how bad it was. You don't remember the negative parts, you remember the best parts. So how does that apply to modern aesthetics? Is you take the parts you think you remember and you make them better, but still confusingly similar to the past. And you don't put things that betray that. Obviously, like no one remembers an iPad on their dad's or grandfather's dashboard, right? So you put that in an old car or classic car, it's obviously not something that was ever there before. Right. It's an obvious betrayal that it's not part of the past. So you find that balance of like, what do you think you remember? And you circle that carefully and you never betray that it's anything other than that, even though the quality is better and the design's better and the fit and finish is better. So what we try to do at Zero Labs from the design development part of it is to say, I want you to look at this car and say, I remember this. You have that like familiarity with it, and what they call in psychology the sort of gestalt, the overall representation of it somehow captured, but it's all new materials made completely different way, functions different, and you're not trying to trick people. Like there's like these window levers that look like roll down windows, and you flip them down and it kind of rolls it up. They're just like a little toggle switch. That is design. That's trying to deceive you thinking it was a roll down window. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something that didn't actually exist at all back then, but you made it look like it could have just been right at home back in the old days.
Right.
But it's just made better with materials that never existed before. That's the opportunity. And so what we love, and we know we've done our job correctly, is when someone says, they'll look at the car and go, man, I love the way they used molded plywood back then. It's just so cool. Like, yeah, man, your cars, like,
sure.
You nailed it. That never existed back then. But the fact that you think it did means we've done our job.
Right.
If you're confused as to where does the past leave off and where does the future kick in, if we do that well, you don't know. And you actually have to walk around and point to people like, this used to have door hinges. External door hinges doesn't have those. You didn't notice that, right? You didn't notice the fact that this bumper flips down and behind that is a charge port because it's hidden. You didn't notice the fact that all the window seals are gone and it's flush glass now, but you didn't notice it. You just kind of like it better, but you don't know why.
Sure.
That's kind of the fun of it. But like I said earlier, like that's a very special degree of design language. Most people don't. The automotive world cares a lot, and our clients care a lot. But I think most people on a volume level just want a crappier version of the old version. Like a little bit restamped version. That's what that's led to in our industry is an overpopulation of very shitty versions of classic cars. You're taking the crash parts, kicking it out the door in 12 weeks, and it's awful and it breaks down and people hate it. Then they come to synonymize that with the industry itself. When really that's just a bad a list of bad actors, who've made a terrible car that has the same name as your car.
Gotcha. And, when you're kind of thinking of making things familiar, I think of essentially I don't even know what you want to call it, but so instead of a rotary dial, right, there is an actual, like a gear shift lever, right? And then in addition to that, I also thought it was kind of cool. I don't think they ever came with Broncos with twin stick, transfer cases, but you have sort of that, right? You can control the front EDM and rear EDM, separately. I don't know if you can put one in high and one in low and freak the thing out, but that's kind of cool, actually. Yeah,
it functions. It's a digital transfer case.
So that I thought was kind of interesting. Now I'm kind of curious. So it's high, low. So do each drive module have a 2-speed gearbox then, or?
These are, no, it's not actually using the gearbox so much as it's throttling. So it's sort of like you're just adjusting your pot map ratios. So you're just making it twice as hard to go as fast. What we call it increases the resolution.
Sure.
So if you're rock crawling, you don't want and you're into drive mode, like what we call like rocket. We have some drive profiles that are truly terrifying.
Right.
And we have clients who love them. They're like, I only want this. Other ones are like, they want more what we call like a confident yacht.
Yeah.
I hit it, but I want a minute where I go, okay,
sure.
I'll give you that power slowly. Not the one that's like a rocket on a tricycle. Like you're going to fall over. You're going to die if you keep your foot on the pedal. But this is prevent that. So if you are going off road, you don't have to worry about shooting off the top of the mountain. We actually almost did that once. We were doing a video where we did a conversion, and we took this really terrible. The video is called Retrobution. It's probably like 3-4 years old now. We took a really crappy car, like it was like a rusted Bronco. It was beat to hell. It was like the door was held together with bungee cords. We were wearing snowboard goggles while we were driving it because there was so much rust inside the car we couldn't see. But we gave the car full power, and we drove up the top of this mountain laughing our heads off. Like you shouldn't be able to do this. And we did the conversion in 12 hours and, shot up the top of the mountain, and we were going so fast. We didn't realize that we were like, this is the top of the mountain. We were going like this at like 35 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour. And what was below us was a drop off. So we slammed on the brakes and skidded and got real lucky, but our front wheel went over. That would have been useful to have the transfer case so you prevent yourself from shooting off the top like that.
Gotcha.
But it is reminiscent of what we used to love with the old transfer case. Truthfully, you don't need that. You could just flip in driver mode, and all that. But it does feel like something we used to have control over. So it's like manual control over digital technology.
I mean, I had a twin stick and a diesel Ranger I built, and you could do it, right? You could decouple the rear if you're spinning out. You're like, you know what? You need to chill out. And then in the front, I can go all the way to low and then just slowly pull myself through something. So it's kind of neat that you can do it. Now, I'm assuming since it's just a 1-speed gearbox, do you offer like locking differentials or anything like that, or are they open diffs within them?
We're right now we're open. Well, I think no, we're limited slip.
Okay.
Because we're also right now we're independent front and rear suspension, so we don't have a solid axle. We have talked about going back to solid axle just purely from a cost and manufacturing timeline perspective. The only issue for me with a solid axle is you abandon the most critical real estate we have in a classic car, which is the space between the axles.
Yeah.
You can't, and I know this is an unpopular thing to say in the DIY world, but you can't put a 600-pound battery in the front of your car and the rear of the car and expect that to perform well. Because the problem with that is that your roll center is so off.
Right.
Now your steering is all broken, your linkage is broken, your track stability is all broken. That car, it's like trying to have someone run down a track wearing a 50-pound hat.
Sure.
You're not going to run a straight line. You're like, and you're over here and when you put those giant heavy motors over the axles, your steering cannot compensate for that. So you want your weight to be in the center like you would have a modern car. That's why we choose not to sacrifice the center of the axles, because that's where all of our batteries, 100% of our battery is in between the axles.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, if you were to do solid axles, there are companies that do essentially drive modules that would bolt into essentially the center section of a solid axle. Is that the route you'd
Yeah.
go, or do you think you'd have a remote
I would do
engine?
that. Yeah.
Okay.
And that didn't exist, that didn't exist 4 years ago, but there's several companies. Dana has some, and CATL has some, and some other manufacturers are now doing powered axles. More specifically, they're now making them for non-commercial class vehicles,
No, it's just interesting, but the weight's, it's a lot of, unsprung mass, right? Too, that you have to deal with. Just the whole.
Yeah, and
drive
there's
moment.
also, I think in-wheel, in-wheel probably would be, if I had to guess, in-wheel is probably where we'll end up one day.
Okay.
The value of in-wheel is, of course, you have torque vectoring, which gives you full control, but just the packaging, like to even not only get the center space back, but to also get the axle space back, I mean, our motor cradles are enormous.
Right.
And it's a huge amount of space wasted. You could fill either one of those with batteries too,
Sure.
So maximizing the available space. In the classic car, you don't get to decide where you put it. You have to work backwards.
Sure.
A new car can go, let's make it 16 feet long and 8 feet wide and put some seats on it. You're like, great. You've got a 130 kilowatt battery. You can do that with new cars. You can't do that with older cars. You're just like, what space do we really have? And you got to work backwards. And that's where it gets challenging.
So when I looking through some of the images of your platform, and this is no offense by this, but it looks heavily fabricated, right? Now, I think that's probably key to essentially adapting it to so many different vehicles. But I guess can we talk a little bit about its strategy? So do you essentially have your standard battery cradle for it, and then your engine cradles? Are you varying height? How do you go about setting your platform up for essentially, numerous manufacturers of roughly the same era?
So that's a good question. Our approach has been to address vehicle class and not necessarily vehicle models themselves. So say, for example, we obviously started off with the Bronco because you got to start with something.
Right.
And started off with the Bronco. Then we said, well, what else is like the Bronco? And, a Land Rover is like a Bronco. Defender 90 is very much like a Bronco. And so is a Scout. And so is a Toyota FJ40, right? Or 44. So then you start realizing you're actually pretty close to each other already. There was a little bit of modification, because OEMs, I've said this on stage and I got kind of booed at once, but I don't care. It's true. OEMs kind of copy each other. They still do it. If you can't tell the difference between like this car and that car, that's not a coincidence. They're like, oh my God, we actually came up with exactly the same answer at the same time. Like, no, you deliberately copied each other because you recognize the popularity of the class and you want to offer your version of that.
Sure.
And so that's always been happening, even go back to the 30s, people copied each other, So the opportunity in that for us is that we exploit that fact, like from a top level perspective. Is a Bronco different than a Bantam or a Jeep or a Land Rover or a Defender 90 from a top perspective? Yeah, they're very different. The interiors are different, the way it looks. But from a format perspective, is it really different? No, not really.
Yeah. So you almost have now like a bottom up approach. So
Correct.
You essentially, whether you scan them or you look at them, like, okay, all of these things have a very similar footprint, very similar wheelbase or whatever's going on, maybe some slight changes there. And then, so what type of modifications are you doing then to get your platform to the unique body?
Well, you have, every frame is specifically made for that model, right? The mount points have to be precise, and the balance has to be precise, and your wheelbases and your axle widths are all gonna be different. Your track widths are different. But they're similar enough that the amount of work it takes us to move one to the other isn't significant.
Okay.
So we do get tricked sometimes, and we think like we're easy. And then like we took a Bronco and made it into a Land Rover pretty seamlessly, but to then take a Land Rover and turn it to an early Defender, that was a pain in the ass. That was hard because it's like they did some weird shit back then with like weird center mounts and brackets that were raised off the body that weren't built into the body, like all this weird stuff we didn't know was there. That took a lot more work, but now we've got it. We've kind of got that in our archive. Like someone else wants to order it, it's just another copy now, And so there's not like an infinite number of classic vehicles you would address. I think everyone thinks like, well, how do you address like, I want to do a 1940s Ferrari Enzo and a Russian fire truck. Can that chassis work for both of them? Like, no, not at all. But if we decide we can handle like let's say a classic F series pickup truck, it probably would work pretty close to another classic F series pickup trucks. And of that era, could that help support a CJ? Probably, or a Dodge Power Wagon, probably, because they're not that different. And so you reuse what you can, and you just got to make specific calibrations for the rest. Like we're working on right now a Jeep Wagoneer that is in the 90s series. It's really similar from a wheelbase from a Land Rover, but the mount points and suspension is really different, but once we have it,
Sure.
We're done. Yeah.
So because it's interesting, it looks like it's mostly short, long arm setups, front and rear. And then, there's not a lot of images, but I'm kind of curious. It kind of speaks to your point about the Russian fire truck, but then, like the C1 Corvette, and then you have the Mustang overlay. So that, obviously very, very different vehicles, aside from the other ones. A similar approach though, essentially, like we have our battery, we protect it for the size battery we want. We know where our drive modules are. We know roughly that we're still using short, long arms, front and rear. And then you end up doing something a little bit like less of an engine cradle, or do you end up something similar just on essentially flexing to different planes because they're unibody?
Well, so muscle cars, for example, there's a split. Some are body on frame, right? And we could work with that. And some are unibody, and you can't do body on frame in unibody because you have literally no floor space. Like in a unibody, you drill a hole in the floor, you're inches off the pavement,
right?
So unibody is a different design entirely. Unibody we've been working on this for a while, but unibody will probably end up being in-wheel motors and a really different design for battery. It has to be. We're kind of waiting on unibody, where there's a new generation of batteries that's coming out, and that will be much more supportive of unibodies for us. Also, the in-wheel motors are good, but a lot of them are very energy intensive to cool, because you have every motor, you have to have an inverter, and every inverter you have to have a cooling system, and you can't put them in series, because then you've got one big 4 motors. The next motor is hotter than the motor before it, and that motor inherits the heat of 2 motors, and so you have to sort of separate your loops. So there's a lot of problems with that. But I think that's a problem that can be overcome pretty soon. Putting brakes and motors next to each other, those are the two. The inverter and the inverter, motor, and brakes are like the 3 hottest part of an electric vehicle, and have them all directly and next to each other is not a good cooling problem to solve. It's a thermal management nightmare.
Sure.
But I think when we get into unibodies, it's its own challenge.
Sure.
Right now we're just doing body on frames, whether it's pickup trucks, we're moving into muscle cars, and we're moving into obviously SUVs we've been doing for a while.
Right.
And there's another class too, which is like the long sedans, like the Lincolns and the Cadillacs. And so those are actually, funny enough, they're just like pickup trucks, like a Continental uses an F100 frame, No,
it's interesting. It's kind of it's an interesting approach. And wheel hub motors are interesting. We have a few here on display. We've worked with a few companies. There's a lot of packaging is their biggest advantage. They have unique challenges. There's a lot of weight outside, so you end up with essentially sometimes dampening that mass could be troublesome at times. But I think honestly, if you were to go that way and even do solid axle, so in wheel hub motors on a stick axle, a simple one, that type of vehicle, your Land Rovers and stuff like that, they're not as susceptible to. I mean, they have a lot of mass there, but the use case is less dynamic, if that makes sense, unlike a sports car, right? If you're doing a C1 Corvette conversion or something like that.
Honestly, if you're an off-road gearhead and you're like, what about the unsprung mass? That to me is like one of those like superstitious beliefs, right? The reason I say that is because if you really cared about it, why do you have steel wheels? Why do you have a 100-pound tire? Why are you using 6-inch Brembo brakes? I mean, the combined weight of that thing is like 175 pounds per wheel.
Sure.
Forget in-wheel motors. Like that's a heavy ass gas wheel, period. And so I think that if you really cared about unsprung mass, you'd have like super lightweight wheels, super light, like aluminum with like a smaller brake kit, and you'd have a much lighter suspension, but they're using like big, heavy shocks, heavy wheels, heavy tires, um, heavy everything. Like the combined weight of that whole thing is enormous. And you're telling me that unsprung mass is an issue for you. I'm like, what you have is equal to the weight of an electric motor.
Yeah. I mean, obviously I think it's a little different if you're trying to get, tire size is, whatever you're trying to do for ground clearance or an airing down, steel wheels, they're nice because you can kind of fix them on the trail. You can bang them back into place. I don't run them anymore, in part because I try to balance fuel range and fuel mileage. So I pick tire. I don't exclusively do this, but when it comes to tire and wheels, I look at those combinations of weight pretty closely, and overall footprint. But no, I mean, your point, it's still valid, right? It just, it's a weird segment to kind of talk about that, unless you're doing essentially the go fast off-roading, when now you're in the whole separate, kind of tier of that. So
you learn a lot about, like, this industry is interesting because you work on the off-road side and you learn a lot about sort of the consumer psychology and the idea of masculine, right? And then you work on the electric side of the vehicle, and you learn a lot about consumer psychology and the masculine, but you put them two together and you start seeing these like uncertainties. Like, they think that these things are really important, and you go like, well, maybe it isn't more important. Maybe it's just like, I was told to believe it's important. So it's like this tribal mentality that you have to have a lot of loud, like, noise equals power, and it doesn't. Noise equals inefficiency, torque is power, power is power. And so then where I think the electric vehicles will absolutely win out over the long term is you have a performance argument that just can't be rivaled. You have an available power that just can't be rivaled. And you also have upgradability that you can't do with a gas car, and the combination of all of them over the long term is just going to be where it ends up. Like, you drive one of these cars off road, driving an electric car off road is not like any experience you've ever had. Like, you think driving a Tesla's fun? Go to the desert and let loose and watch. Just, you're giggling because the plume of dust you're leaving behind you is incredible, but you have full control, and you're really driving something that doesn't seem like it's even struggling. Where a gas car, you do that, you can tell the engine's really struggling. It's like loud and gurgling, and you're throttling it. Electric car does that effortlessly, and it's silent, and you're out in the wilderness going hauling ass. There's nothing like that experience. There's kind of no going back after that,
Yeah, I mean, I haven't wheeled anything that hard, off-road electric. I've driven around like the EV Ranger, and it's very different. Like, the amount of the knobby tires that's all you actually hear, right? And you hear a lot of other things as well that you would never hear in essentially like a gas-powered Polaris or something like that, right? You actually can't really hear yourself in a gas-powered, Polaris. No, it's kind of obviously there's a lot of people that liked it. And I myself like it too. But I kind of think this is I try to look at everything as far as, you have those, either the time capsules, where the history came from, and then there's how do I continue to enjoy this as it goes forward, and I think the EVs are very interesting, and they offer, like you said, quite a bit. And it's I think it's neat that you guys are doing it, and kind of have gone through, and you're kind of dedicated to try and keep some of these vehicles going longer, so to speak.
I think it's making them perform in ways they never have before. Like, let's say you're doing a marathon or something, or a mountain race or something, and all of a sudden this like 70-year-old man shoots past you like you're standing still. You're like, what the fuck just happened? Like, it's more, one of the reasons we like classic cars is there's sort of a defiance that comes with it. Like, wait a minute, that's not supposed to be happening. The cars should have died 50 years ago. And there it is. And it just drove past you. And you're marveling at how beautiful it is. But I think what's special about it is that that's not supposed to be happening. Like, that shouldn't be happening right now. Like, the car isn't on the road, that we've replaced that car, and yet here it is. Add to that now a performance gain that's better than new cars, and you're really fucking with people's heads.
Sure.
You're like, wait a minute, that car that shouldn't even be on the road just shot past a Porsche like it was standing still. Like, I was driving a Land Rover, which never made it more than 40 miles an hour. Um, and I drove one of those and I shot past a Cybertruck that was going fast.
Yeah.
I just went right past him. And because I had a motor profile setting when mine was wide open.
Right.
And this guy was in a fast car, but I shot past him like he was standing still. And I filmed it. And it was hilarious because like here I am driving like this like grandpa car and I'm going past him like he's standing still. And that's a performance car, a modern electric performance car. Those moments are special. And I think I think they send a message of what's possible. And I think that the driver every single time has this really beautiful personal satisfaction. I just did something that's not supposed to be possible.
Right.
And I can do it whenever I want to,
So do you think, I feel like I already know the answer to this, but for some things in time, right? Like you had your old Duesenbergs, and there's a lot of people that still like your Model A Fords, Model Ts, and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
But I think, from like the late 60s and 70s, all the vehicles that are built there are in a very interesting space, right? Like I don't know why. Same thing with the music. Everything about like culture then is very interesting and sometimes in some ways transcends many generations. Like those are cars that my dad grew up with, but the first car, it wasn't the first vehicle I had, but the first car I ever bought out of a junkyard was a 68 Fastback Mustang. So when I brought it home, all the guys from the block came around and like, oh, this is cool. And they thought it was super cool that I was that interested in it, because that was cars that they were interested in. And they thought it was interesting that I was so interested into it. But, I think like, various movies, they're still using like Chevelles and Mustangs. And I think it's almost transcended. That's kind of my thought is, generation after generation, they're cool cars and they look like nothing else, and nothing else will ever look like them for a lot of reasons: safety, aerodynamics, all that other stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's it lends itself to the appeal of what you're doing. But do you agree with that? That essentially these are kind of timeless.
What you're talking about is a function in psychology called transference, and so basically, to use a different analogy, your village elders validated your choice. And you got met with accolades. And so they're teaching you that in this tribe, we value this. You're like, good job. You get patted on the shoulder. You're more likely to feel positive about it because you just got validation from your village elders.
Right.
And so you're now kind of like your preferences are sort of locked in by that. And that 5,000 years ago is how every decision was made.
Right.
You only did things that pleased the elders. And now that is changing, so like the things that we think like, that are important to us aren't going to be that important to somebody else. Like I was born in the 70s and 80s. I like cars from 70s and 80s. But if you're born in the 90s, you're not going to be into Broncos and Land Rovers so much. You're going to be into like Nissans and Subarus.
Sure.
And I'm like, Subarus, like, but that is a classic car now.
Yeah,
it's
no,
21 years
100%.
old. You're like, all right, that's not my era. My dad's cars, we're British. I don't give a fuck about like Aston Martin DBs and stuff, because or old Jaguars and stuff. They're cool, but they do nothing for me. The only reason I like them is because my dad liked them, but that's where it comes from. So I think like the ones that are out of our generation and we like because of our generation, there's 100% chance is because, that is why most people like the football or baseball teams they like, or basketball teams, not because you independently went out and just go, I'm going to watch every game of every sport and decide that particular team is the one for me. You're going to go like, you like it because you grew up and with your neighbors and your family screaming at the television for that particular thing. You've learned that culturally, not because you independently decided that. And that's where a lot of our preferences come from. That's where our values come from. And all of our beliefs come from that. There's no different for cars, but then it gets confusing because if you like a car that your dad liked and you show positivity, then your kids come along and they like it too. Now we're getting confused because now it's like a tradition more than it is a preference,
Yeah. I just also think that like they generally are unique in their shape. Like 90s, it's weird that a Fox body Mustang is now classic and people are talking about old Celica GTs. Like you see them at car shows, you're like, that's a Honda, EX. It's just a VVT cam but they're at car shows now because not many of them made it,
The dividing line, I think, is when plastics became the way to go versus steel. Like we like doing classic cars that are mostly steel because they're simpler. I'm not going to remake someone's plastics. You know, like, can you do a 2003 Toyota Land Cruiser? Yeah, but I'm not remaking your plastic for you. You know, like, it's going to have plastic and you're going to deal with that. Like, we're not going to go and like rebuild all the plastic. That would cost millions of dollars. So you're just going to have to deal with the fact that it's mostly plastic, you know. But at a certain generation that stopped, you know, I would say like mid 80s, there was that split between when do we start using a lot of plastics and when we keep it minimal, you know, and plastic was pretty minimal then. So that's why 70s and 60s and 50s are all steel, you know, and they're beautiful because they're metal.
Right.
And then we sculpted those shapes versus vac forming them.
Right.
You know, or injection molding them.
No, it's interesting, but thanks. No, again, I appreciate. I saw you got a call and someone stopped in, but Madam, I really appreciate you kind of taking time to talk with us.
Yeah, man.
And it's cool. I dig old stuff, you know, and I kind of it's interesting what you guys are doing, and I'm interested to kind of watch it as it kind of develops as well. So
yeah, I mean, this is the future of our past, you know.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, man.